Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the structure and role of the House of Commons and House of Lords in Edexcel A-level politics. I'm going to start by giving you an introduction to Parliament, looking at what it consists of and its four key main functions. We're then going to look at the selection of members of the House of Commons and Lords, and then finally going in detail on the main functions of Parliament and the extent to which they're fulfilled. The functions of passing legislation and scrutinising the executive are covered in much more detail, as I'll explain in other videos on the Politics Explained YouTube channel. In particular, the way that Parliament interacts with the executive and Parliament's scrutiny and the legislative process. So make sure to have a look at those. But we're in particular in this video going to look in detail at Parliament's function of representing the electorate and some key arguments you can use on either side of that debate. The PDF you can see on your screen is part of an updated textbook on the UK government section of Edexcel A-level politics that you can purchase on the Politics Explained website, where you can also find loads of other resources to help you in Edexcel A-level politics, including these updated textbooks covering every single part of the course. Once you purchase them, they continue to update throughout your A-level to make sure that you keep up to date as politics changes so quickly every week and every month. There's also detailed essay plans covering every single part of the course, which update throughout the year as well. There's places, as well as a place to sign up for tutoring and some revision webinars we do before the exams every year, if that's something you'd be interested in. Without further ado, let's get into it. So starting off looking at the parts of specification, this is of course part of the Parliament subtopic, and we're going to look at the selection of members of the House of Commons and Lords, including the different types of peers and the main functions of the Commons and Lords and the extent to which they're fulfilled. The most important debates on this topic relate to how effective Parliament is at carrying out its key functions, and as I mentioned, a couple of these key functions that you're going to use in your essays, legislation, passing legislation and scrutiny of the government, are covered in much more detail in other videos. But what we're going to look at in detail in this video is Parliament's representative role near the end, and some key arguments and examples on either side. And that could be a key essay question on its own, such as evaluate the view that Parliament is representative of the electorate, but will also be really useful in relation to a question on, for example, evaluate the view that Parliament performs its functions effectively, where it will be kind of one paragraph as part of three, with one other on passing legislation and one other on scrutiny of the executive, which is a key way I'd recommend structuring it. Yeah, let's start with an introduction to Parliament. So Parliament consists of the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And the House of Commons is elected and the more powerful chamber as a result, whilst the House of Lords is unelected and less powerful. The UK is said to have a parliamentary government, with the legislative and executive branches fused. So it's a fusion of powers, unlike a separation of powers in the United States. And what that means is that all government ministers, including the Prime Minister, are members of Parliament. They're all MPs or members of the House of Lords. The Prime Minister, for example, is an MP as well and represents a constituency, as do all government ministers. A party is able to form a government when they have a majority in the House of Commons. That's where the executive comes from Parliament. You can only become the government if you've got a majority of MPs, and all of the government ministers come from, or the key ministers from the House of Commons come from those MPs. Parliament has to approve all government legislation, and Parliament holds the government to account. And crucially, this is different from the US, a presidential government, which is based on the separation of powers between the legislature and the executive, as you'll look at in lots of detail if you study the US part of the course next year. Parliament has four main functions: to pass legislation, to scrutinise the executive, to provide ministers to the government, and to represent the electorate, which we'll have a look at in more detail later on in the video. Okay. In terms of selection of members to the House of Commons, so each of the 650 members of Parliament in the House of Commons is elected by a constituency and represents a constituency. They're elected by first past the post, and constituencies are around 75,000 members. I think they're now actually a little bit more, around 85,000, 90,000 members on average. But there is significant variation still as well. So the Isle of Wight used to have two constituencies, each with a population of under 57,000, and it used to just have one constituency of over 110,000. The vast majority of MPs belong to political parties and are selected as candidates by their local constituency branch. And this is sometimes where they have really strong local connections, and that's why they're selected. They might have been a councillor or a head of a council for a long time, but sometimes the central party can also parachute candidates in if they want someone they think has really good political talent, they might just get stuck in a constituency, even though they don't have links to the local area, and they're then there to represent them. For example, Torsten Bell, former leader of the think tank Resolution Foundation, was chosen to be candidate for Swansea West despite not being Welsh, and that's for the Labour Party. In terms of selection of members to the House of Lords, there's no fixed number of members of the House of Lords. And crucially, none of the members are elected, and the vast majority are appointed. So there are currently 776, I think that might be slightly more now, but in the past there have been over 800 members. Members of the House of Lords may belong to a political party or may be crossbenchers who don't belong to any party. In March 2025, there are 273 Conservative members, 187 Labour, 184 crossbenchers, and 78 Liberal Democrats out of a total of over 800 members in the House of Lords. So that's now gone above 800 members. And there are three different types: Lord Spiritual, Hereditary Peers, and Appointed Life Peers. So there are 26 bishops from the Church of England who are there. They're not appointed by the government, for example. There are still 92 Hereditary Peers who were there due to belonging to noble aristocratic families. They were before Tony Blair's reform to the House of Lords. The vast majority of the House of Lords were Hereditary Peers. And crucially, the majority of the House of Lords now are appointed life peers, and that's since the 1999 House of Lords Act, which was the Blair government's reforms. And they're appointed for their lifetime without that period passing on to their children. And there are a number of different ways life peers are appointed to the House of Lords, all of which are overseen by the House of Lords Appointments Commission, which advises the Prime Minister on the appropriateness of appointments. Some of these appointments are non-political, and they're nominated directly by the Appointments Commission due to their expertise, and they're designed to kind of ensure diversity and experience and skills in the House of Lords. But others can be seen as political and are nominated by the government, including direct ministerial appointments, which is when the government appoints someone to the House of Lords so that they can be a minister. Key recent examples of that might be David Cameron under Sunak's government, or James Timpson under the current Labour government. Dissolution honours, which is when at the end of each parliament before a general election, parties nominate MPs who are leaving the Commons to be appointed to the Lords, and they might be some high-profile MPs, for example, and may be used by a Prime Minister or a party to reward them for their service. And resignation honours, which is when appointments are made by a Prime Minister when they step down from office. And there's a particular concern over all of these last types, which are really kind of less directly controlled by the House of Lords Appointments Commission and more driven by parties, leaders, and the Prime Minister. And there's concern that they're kind of used by Prime Ministers to appoint those they're close to and those who have donated to their party, which led to concerns over corruption. And we looked at this in the party funding video. So when Leader of the Opposition, Starmer, criticised recent Tory governments for undermining trust in politics by handing peerages to what he called lackeys and donors, such as Boris Johnson's friend and Evening Standard owner Evgeny Lebedev, and billionaire Conservative Party donor David Harding. We looked at the cash for peerages scandal in the party funding video. There's also been a lot of these kind of instances where significant party donors are made members of the House of Lords. For example, Lord Ali is a really good example of this, who was engaged in a significant scandal, or involved in a significant scandal last summer. The Passes for Glasses scandal just after Labour came into government effectively. Boris Johnson's resignation honours led to controversy due to accusations that they rewarded personal loyalty over public service. For example, some key kind of allies such as Priti Patel and Jacob Rees-Mogg were made members of the House of Lords, whilst peerages were also gave out to 3 of Johnson's special advisors, showing their kind of real political appointments and linked to political loyalty to a Prime Minister. In particular, controversial was Charlotte Owen, who was appointed despite just being 2019 and having worked as a special advisor for just 1 year. And it's confirmed that 8 people Johnson wanted to place in the second chamber were rejected by the House of Lords Appointment Commission as well. We can say this has continued under Labour, when in December, over 1 week, they made 30 nominations for peerages, including former Chief of Staff Sue Gray, to address the imbalance of the chamber, as the Conservatives, having been in power for so long, had appointed a lot of Conservative Party members. These included former MPs, Tanguy Debonair, close allies such as Angie Hunter, and trade unionists such as Brendan Barber. And these were Labour loyalists and allies, which highlights the limitations of the current selection process, as governments are incentivised toward peerages based on political favouritism rather than expertise. And there's been a particular concern over PMs kind of appointing those they are close to. On the other hand, because a lot of politicians are appointed through this process, it can be argued that it's actually a strength, as it means that a lot of kind of former politicians with political and legislative experience are appointed to the second chamber. Again, a key criticism of the House of Lords is that a lot of these members of the House of Lords actually aren't very good at legislative scrutiny or don't turn up much. Lord Sugar's a really good example of that. He's now kind of, since being appointed in 2009, attended less than 2% or voted in less than 2% of divisions in the House of Lords. Really important bill kind of introduced by Labour since the election is the House of Lords Hereditary Peers Bill. Still hasn't passed when I'm recording this video, but I'm sure it will. And effectively, that's going to introduce a mandatory retirement age of 80, and it's not going to completely change the House of Lords like they spoke of in their manifesto. But what it's going to do is their kind of first key reform mentioned in the manifesto, which is removing the remaining 92 hereditary peers, which they see as key to modernising the House of Lords effectively. Of course, Conservative peers have been working to obstruct the bill's passage, and the hereditary peers will as well, but due to the Salisbury Convention, because it was in the government's manifesto, there's not too much they can do. Of course, we look more at the Salisbury Convention in the next video on Parliament in the playlist, and effectively, because it was in the manifesto, it's almost certainly going to get passed. Moving on now to the main functions of Parliament and the extent to which they're fulfilled, and the first of these is passing legislation. Of course, we did this. We're going to look at this in way more detail in the kind of the legislative process and House of Commons and Lords video on the Politics Explained YouTube channel, which you can find on the UK government playlist. But effectively, it's a key function, as the most important function of Parliament is to pass laws. It's a supreme legislative body in the UK, and through passing laws, it's effectively how it makes significant changes to the country and to policy in the country. The government has kind of significant, really dominates the legislative process. It initiates the vast majority of bills, and as the government has a majority in the House of Commons and often a large one, it's very rarely defeated and often easily able to pass the reforms and the laws and the policies it wants to through the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Whips are highly important to the passage of legislation, as they're responsible for ensuring that MPs attend parliamentary votes and for granting leave if their vote isn't essential. So they often issue written instructions to attend a vote and vote along with their party. And if they're underlined 3 times, that's the strongest kind of whipping, and that's known as a 3-line whip. And crucially, whips play a key role in the power of patronage as well. They can work with the Prime Minister to offer those who are loyal ministerial posts, even junior ones, as a kind of incentive to toe the party line effectively. A good example of the government's dominance of the legislative process is that Sunak was able to pass a number of key pieces of legislation, including the Safety of Rwanda Act and the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act, despite being very unpopular, and that was linked to the fact that he had a big majority effectively, and due to the fact that the government has a significant control over the legislative process. The House of Lords also votes on legislation, but doesn't have the same amount of power as the House of Commons. It can't interfere with money bills, and can only amend non-financial legislation with a 1-year delaying power due to the Parliaments Act, which we'll look at in more detail in the kind of legislative process and House of Commons and Lords video. So they can kind of delay and can have a significant impact, but only for a year. Due to its 1-year delaying power, they don't have a veto like they used to. So the arguments you can bring in that Parliament is effective in passing legislation is that due to its majority and the power of the whips, the government rarely has a problem passing bills through the House of Commons, and legislation is almost always passed effectively. The House of Lords kind of does offer amendments, but rarely halts the passage of legislation. But the House of Lords can be seen as kind of really important in scrutinising legislation, offering technical amendments. In emergencies, Parliament is able to push legislation through in a short amount of time. For example, recently on the 12th of April, Parliament was called on a Saturday to pass kind of an emergency bill giving Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds the power to direct British Steel to kind of prevent a Scunthorpe plant from shutting down. And that was passed in just 6.5 hours. Was a really good example. While some private members' bills are also really important. Again, as I mentioned, as I kept saying, we look at these kind of arguments and some examples in more detail in the legislative process video. On the other hand, there's a number of ways in which Parliament is ineffective at passing legislation. The vast majority of private members' bills aren't passed, particularly if they don't have government support. The House of Lords only has a 1-year delaying power, but that can be significant in kind of holding up the government's agenda in certain cases. And when the government has a small or no majority, rebellions can be really disruptive in preventing important legislation from being passed. For example, both Theresa May and Boris Johnson failed to pass their withdrawal agreements when they didn't have a majority in the House of Commons. Whilst this rushing through of legislation can also lead to kind of increasingly poor scrutiny and unworkable laws. And that's kind of also linked to the fact that more recently it's common for legislation to be rushed through the House of Commons with not as much scrutiny. So the illegal migration bill was given just 2 days to be scrutinised by the House of Commons in the committee stage before being passed on to the House of Lords. Really not detailed scrutiny that you would have seen previously. But again, more examples, more detail on that in the other video that I mentioned. Again, scrutinising the executive is a key role of Parliament. The government comes from Parliament, and Parliament is given the task to hold it to account, which it does through a number of ways. Ministerial questions, including PMQs, label members of Parliament, including the opposition, to directly ask questions to government ministers and the Prime Minister in Prime Minister's questions, and the opposition can hold them to account through that. Select committees and a range of different debates are also really, really important. But again, much more detail on that on the parliamentary scrutiny video on the playlist. Another key function that you're not necessarily I wouldn't recommend kind of bringing into your essay so much if it was a question on the extent to which Parliament's functions are fulfilled effectively. I'd do one on legislation, one on representing the electorate, and one on scrutiny. But another key kind of role of Parliament is to provide ministers to the government. As we looked at, the government comes from Parliament. It's not a presidential system. So the vast majority of these ministers from the House of Commons are selected by the Prime Minister using their powers of patronage, but some do come from the House of Lords as well, such as Minister James Timpson, who was made kind of prisons minister by Starmer by being made a peer effectively. And overall, Parliament can be seen as effective in providing the government with ministers. However, some ministers lack the expertise in their department, especially as there's a lot of kind of reshuffles and changing between departments, which might be seen as a counterpoint to that. The function we're going to have a look at in detail in this video is representing the electorate. So the UK is a democracy, and Parliament is elected to represent and implement the views and wishes of the population. You could get a question in the exam on something quite specific, like to what extent is Parliament representative, or evaluate the view that Parliament is representative of the electorate. And in this, I'd break it down effectively in 3 paragraphs on 3 different ways of thinking about representation. Firstly, how democratic it is. Secondly, how well it kind of represents the issues and interests of constituents in the population. And a final paragraph on how descriptively representative it is. Firstly, looking at whether it's democratic, some key ways we can say that Parliament is representative is that members of the House of Commons are democratically elected on a regular basis, with each MP representing a relatively small number of voters in their constituency, and that means that these voters can hold their representatives to account and remove them if they're judged to have not represented them effectively. And that's also including through the Recall of MPs Act, for example, but also more importantly, just at general elections, removing them. Each MP has to win a plurality of votes in their constituency in order to get elected, whilst many win a majority of voters. A good recent example of that kind of real kind of representation in terms of democracy is that 5 pro-Gaza MPs were elected in the 2024 general election, despite being independents, because they had high Muslim populations in the area, for whom the kind of Israel's war in Palestine, and in Gaza, and the Palestine issue were a really key issue. And they were, because it was such an important issue for these populations, they were able to unseat a number of kind of Labour or Conservative sitting MPs. And that really shows how members of Parliament can really effectively represent their constituencies and the key issues that are important to them. And now they formed an alliance, an independent alliance, in the House of Commons, given the same number of MPs as Reform and the Green Party. On the other hand, ways in which Parliament isn't representative in terms of democracy are quite clear. The House of Lords is unelected, yet holds significant powers to influence policy, scrutinise the government, and delay legislation. Party leaders, and therefore prime ministers, are selected by their parties rather than by the electorate, with two recent prime ministers, Sunak and Truss, not being party leaders in an election, yet seeking to implement significant political changes, whilst the House of Commons can also be seen as limited in terms of its representation democratically, because of first past the post, and that's a good synoptic link. It's very unproportional and very unrepresentative in comparison to other voting systems. So the current Parliament has 63% of the seats being held by Labour, despite the fact they won just 33.7% of the vote in the 2024 election. The next key way we can judge whether Parliament is representative is, does it represent the issues that constituents care about? And we can say first of all that it is. There's relatively small constituencies, and the fact that a single MP is responsible for those who live within the constituency result in effective representation of local interests. MPs handle correspondence from their constituents, or their officers do, and problems their constituents have, and hold weekly constituency surgeries to help directly talk to their constituents and see how they can help them. And they also represent their constituents' interests in Parliament. For example, in October 2022, 33 Tory MPs rebelled against Liz Truss and abstained on a vote on banning fracking, despite the government ordering them to oppose it, including many MP Mark Fletcher of Bolsover, which had a strong local movement in his area, in Bolsover, and that shows they're representing key issues important to their constituents, including voting against the party line on particular issues that are important to their specific constituency. Both the House of Commons and Lords can also be seen as really important in representing the population as a whole on issues they care about. For example, in relation to Partygate, there was significant pressure from within Parliament on the government that eventually resulted in Boris Johnson resigning, whilst that pro-Gaza MP's example is also really good to bring in for this. And that shows how Parliament is representative. MPs are elected on a mandate and respond to the specific concerns of their constituents. On the other hand, we can say that Parliament isn't representative. MPs often don't vote according to their constituents' wishes. Instead, what influences how they vote is almost exclusively how they're whipped. They vote almost always in line with the party line, in line with what the party tells them to do, because that allows them to climb the ministerial ladder or the party ladder, be favoured due to their loyalty, and give them a chance of becoming a minister. For in the last Parliament, the vast majority of MPs rebelled against the party line less than 2% of the time, with just 14 MPs rebelling more than 5% of the time, so still very, very low. Crucially, a lot of MPs have second jobs as well. In the last Parliament, over 90 MPs had second jobs, and they earned millions from them. Effectively, Theresa May, for example, received £2.5 million alone from giving speeches when she was backbencher after being Prime Minister, including many to private equity firms. And you could also argue, actually, as a different point, that the Parliament isn't representative, as MPs focus too much on representing their constituents rather than other key functions of Parliament. Therefore, it's a negative thing. They focus far too much on casework, which should be dealt with by other agencies, such as local councils, whilst MPs should really be focused on scrutinising the government, which is a way of representing the country, rather than local issues, effectively. And of course, we can look at the House of Lords as well and say that many members of the House of Lords don't take their role of scrutinising the executive and representing the public seriously at all. For example, Lord Sugar, as we had a look at. The final thing we can have a look at is in terms of direct representation. And this is the extent to which Parliament looks like the public. Does it represent the public in terms of gender, race, educational background, for example? And on the one hand, we can say that Parliament isn't representative in this regard, as it's highly unrepresentative in terms of gender, race, and educational background. You can pause and have a look at some of the statistics there, both in terms of the House of Commons and in terms of the House of Lords. For example, just 40% of the Commons and 29% of the Lords are women, compared to over half of the population. whilst just 13% of the Commons and 7.3% of the Lords are from minority ethnic backgrounds, compared to over 18% of the population. And statistically, one of the biggest kind of outliers is that 23% of the House of Commons and 57% of the House of Lords went to private schools, compared to just 7% of the general population, and 90% of the Commons went to university, compared to just 42% of the population. And this lack of direct representation can be seen as a big problem, not only because it's unjust and a representative parliament would have symbolic value, but also because actually if you had a more representative parliament descriptively, they'd understand the wishes of the population more effectively, and that would broaden the political agenda. For example, a male-dominated parliament, as it still currently is unlikely to fully understand or seek to address a lot of the discrimination faced by women in society. There are many reasons for this. It doesn't have a party list system, electoral system, where lists could be made representative, so it's partly linked to the kind of first past the post electoral system. Whilst those who are discriminated against in society are less likely to put themselves forward, as they lack the resources to do so, and would face significant discrimination and danger, more danger if elected, as can be seen with the murder of Jo Cox. So in 2024, of the 4,519 candidates who stood from 98 different parties, 69% of them were male, which really shows how that kind of inability and barriers facing women, but it also very much applies to different other kind of groups who are discriminated against or minority groups, harm Parliament's descriptive representation. On the other hand, we can look at the fact that there kind of has been attempts by parties in the House of Lords to improve direct representation. So you've seen significant improvements. So after the 1997 election, just 18% of MPs were women, and 9 MPs from minority ethnic backgrounds, and that has significantly improved, whilst the House of Lords Appointment Commission also seeks to appoint peers with a range of backgrounds, whilst LGBT representation is really effective in the House of Commons in particular, and in Parliament as a whole. While it can be argued that descriptive representation doesn't mean that, or a lack of descriptive representation doesn't mean that Parliament doesn't effectively represent the population, because Parliament doesn't need to be a microcosm of society, and minority groups can be listened to and represented by MPs, even if they're not directly or descriptively represented by them. Yeah, hope you found that video useful. As I mentioned, a lot of the kind of more detail on the functions of passing legislation and scrutiny are covered in other videos on the YouTube channel. Let me know if you've got any comments or questions in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you. And I'll see you in the next video.